Before I come to sort of the energy scenarios, I would like to define two different ways of doing energy projections. One is you do forecasting, which basically means that you have the current situation and forecast what will happen if we don't change anything. So this is basically what we call the business as usual scenario or the reference scenario. What we do from Greenpeace is we do backcasting, which basically means we identify a target in the future and then we work our way backwards. What do we need to do, when and how? So whenever you see an energy scenario, and it's very popular and we also use that as our basis, the World Energy Outlook from the International Energy Agency, which is published always every November. This is not a forecast, what the International Energy Agency says, but it is a projection, what happened if. The problem we see is that many people take that as a sort of a forecast which will definitely happen, which is not the case. We have in our energy scenario also different projections, of course. Very important is how will future renewable energy prices deliver. I have the problem with the pointer. Anyway, the upper graph you see how many percent of the current price will be dropped in the next few years. As renewable energy is a relatively young technology, there is still a possibility to reduce prices, but not all prices. For example, hydropower is a very established old renewable energy source, and therefore we don't see a lot of potential to reduce prices even further, while solar photovoltaics and concentrated solar power are relatively young generations. There, here we are. There's something that you can't really see it. Is there a pointer here? That's better. So you see here the projections for biomass power plants, for example. We see that there is a little potential to reduce the price, but not very much. While this is wave power. This is a very young technology which is not really developed right now, and therefore we can of course decrease the prices. And this is in terms of the actual cents per kilowatt hour. So we see that it will all come down to around 10 to 12 cents, which is then cost competitive. If we compare conventional power like gas and coal, then we see that we have some sort of a break-even point very soon. This is a rather new technology. This is wave power. That's why it's not coming in there in the next years, but all the others are in this range. Nuclear is not on this graph because nuclear is, from our perspective and what we see from international projects, from power plants under construction, by far the most expensive technology we can get. I can give you a very specific example. The UK plans to build one nuclear power plant, and they require a feed-in tariff for nuclear power. And the feed-in tariff in the UK is planned to be 19 cents per kilowatt hour for 35 years, which basically means with this price you can operate solar power plants in the UK more than economic. It's basically half price would be if you produce electricity with solar panels in the UK. The UK is by far the worst location for solar. Those are the price projections for fossil fuels, coal, gas, oil. Again, these projections are very difficult to make, and we actually don't do our own projections for fossil fuel prices. We simply take the projections from the International Energy Agency, because you can rely on one thing in those fossil fuel price projections. Those projections are wrong, and therefore we take somebody else's projections to blame this organization, and we don't do it ourselves. We have we have done an analysis about the current oil production. This is the oil production of the last 50 years. And this is a very, very large survey, which basically takes all oil production wells worldwide into account. Usually, when you have an oil well, you have a production decline of between 2 and 6% per year. Which means, if you see here on this graph, if there are no new oil exploration will take place, this is the decline we will face in the future in terms of oil production. The oil companies always have to go even further in deep water, in Arctic regions, and shale oil or shale gas, so in unconventional resources, in order to keep up the production. Our philosophy is we have to reduce, we have to phase out oil anyway, because of two reasons. One is it is a resource which is not endless, and secondly, which is more important for us actually, is the atmosphere is not endless to keep all the CO2 emissions, so we need to phase out fossil fuels anyway. And rather than investing in new oil exploration in the next 10, 20, 30 years, we invest in technology in order to get independent from oil, because we see and we know that it takes another generation to phase out oil. So it is not a plan also in our global scenario which we achieve in 10 years' time. So we need at least 30 to 40 years. Then we did a survey about the coal reserves, and what we found out that the coal reserve, they are not a limiting factor. So even if we would stop any new mines, we would have more than enough coal to achieve 6 or 7 degrees global warming rather than 2. So coal is not a limiting factor in terms of the resource, but in terms of climate impacts. This is a little bit self-promoting, but anyway, we have published, like the global energy scenario published last year, we published projections for renewable energy since 1998. What we published in 1999, the global wind market, that was our projection. What we thought will be the growth for wind until 2010, and the black line here is what actually happened. So we were very close. Actually, we were too conservative. You see that the growth was actually a little bit higher than we expected. And we have the same success for solar PV. Also, solar PV grew much faster than we projected. I showed this slide because I wanted to make clear that our energy scenarios are not science fictions. We are really working with a scientific partner which is relatively conservative, because we don't want to emphasize a plan which is impossible to implement. Our energy revolution scenarios are done in a team of different stakeholders. We have Greenpeace, different offices. We have Greenpeace offices in over 50 countries around the world. We work with the German Space Agency as our scientific partner, and we have a scientific partner locally. And therefore we did 40 energy scenarios just lately. We did Japan and South Korea and China. And we always have a local partner, because this enables us to have a very good insight, and also to have the latest development, the latest policy trends in the country. So we just don't want to sit somewhere on our desk in Europe and say what Korea or what Taiwan could do. We work in a team, in an international team, and that's very helpful. This is the power plant market since 1970. So basically what you see is this is the amount of new power plants added every year. So you see in this graph that roughly 100,000 megawatts, so 100 big power plants every year have been built between 1970 and 2000. Here this is hydro, this is gas, oil, coal, and the yellow one is nuclear. Around 1985, that was the peak of new nuclear power plants. After Chernobyl happened, the new installed capacity went down and never went up again. You see that it's pretty irrelevant from the global market. Last year, only one new nuclear power plant has been connected to the grid after over 30 years of construction. So in terms of the actual power plant market, nuclear is already very irrelevant because of the very high cost, of very insecure technology, and also very, very long construction times. The average construction time of a nuclear power plant is 12 years. And you see that there is quite a bit of coal still, but also that renewables, this light blue is wind, this yellow is solar, that last 10 years wind and solar pick up quite significantly. In fact, last year that was the first time that more new renewable power plants have been built than coal or conventional. So you see, but unfortunately there's still a lot of new coal power plants built. But now I have the same graph and I just subtract China. And you see, coal almost disappears. So this is India. Almost 90%, 88% of all the new built coal power plants in the last 5 years have been built in China. So the rest of the world, so the other 198 countries did not really go into coal, except India. And some minor project in Europe for repowering. The majority of new power plants is gas, followed by, and more renewables. So what we propose with our energy revolution is not science fiction, is actually to continue the trend of the last 10 years for another 10 years. This is the EU power market. This red bar here shows when the market is liberalized. So the EU market was a monopoly, so each country had a monopoly utility. In Germany, for example, my home country, there were 4 monopolies, so 4 large utilities who divided the country into 4 parts and then supplied it. So there was no freedom of choice. In 1997, the EU decided to liberalize the power market, and now it's fully liberalized, except a few countries, like for example France, still refuses to liberalize because of its high nuclear share. And you see that after liberalization, there's hardly any coal and nuclear in new build. It's all gas plus renewables. The reason why gas is built is gas is by far the cheapest in terms of new power plants, at least in Europe. And renewables are built because of the support programs from the EU. There is a 20% target until 2020. This is the development in Europe in terms of new build minus retired. So this is solar PV. So by far, that was last year. By far the largest part of new power plants were all photovoltaic, followed by wind, and this is basically repowering, so about 200 megawatts of wind have been turned down and replaced by new ones. This is gas, so around 10,000 megawatts new gas has been built, and 5,500 has been retired, so net effect plus 5,000. Then coal, 3,000 have been built, so 3 or 4 power plants. But 5,400 has been retired, so there's a net reduction of coal power plants. And then we have biomass, and here is nuclear. So you see 22 megawatts additional nuclear. That's not a nuclear power plant. It's just the upgrade, sort of the existing power plants had some new turbines in and increased the output a little bit, but more than 1,200 megawatt came off the grid. So nuclear is declining not only in Europe but on a global scale. To summarize the market shares of the last 5 years, almost 10% is solar photovoltaics. Concentrated solar power is just under 1%, it's around 0.5, 5.6%. Wind is 20%, so wind is a very strong technology. Hydro is very strong. It actually picked up in the last few years. Geothermal is very small, also around 0.5%. Biomass 2%. Gas 18%, and 38% is coal. This is, as I said, the majority is built in China, and 1% nuclear. So if you just look at these numbers, you see that nuclear is a very niche technology already in terms of new build. This is the global market. The last that has been published only recently, just 2 weeks ago, $244 billion have been invested in renewables. It is 11% less than the year before, but more than in 2010. But in terms of the capacity added, the overall capacity added is actually 10% up. So the lower investment volume reflects the cheaper cost. Solar PV and wind, the prices went down quite significantly, and that's why the overall investment volume is lower. Top 5 countries in terms of who is actually doing renewable energy. China, because of its sheer size, is basically dominating all statistics worldwide, no matter what you're talking about. Also renewables. So China was #1 in new capacity for renewables, #1 in new hydro capacity, and #1 in new solar collectors. Germany was #1 for new build photovoltaics. And the US was #1 in wind power, biodiesel, and ethanol. And if you look in the ranking 2, 3, 4, 5, you see China, Germany, the US, China, Germany, US. Those are the countries who dominate. Japan is slowly coming up with solar PV, and maybe even wind, but wind is a bit more complicated to build in Japan. And all the other countries, larger countries, are in the lower ranking, but the good news is that the market is diversifying. The wind market now is present in almost 80 countries around the world. So the wind industry is not just an industry. When I started working in this renewable campaign and the renewable energy work as an engineer, I always had the example Denmark and Germany, and that's it. And now I'm really pleased to say that there are 80 countries who actually do this. In terms of the overall market volume, this is the development. Solar PV, 100,000 megawatts are now installed. For those who don't have the real feeling, what is 100,000 megawatts? That's roughly 2.5 times the capacity Taiwan has. Then we have 283,000 megawatts of wind, and on the lower level concentrated solar power only 2,500, but you see it starts to grow quite rapidly as well. So those 3 technologies are booming, and we hope that this boom will continue. In terms of employment, and that's a very important thing, worldwide we have about 5.7 to 7.5 million employees. The problem is that the statistics is not really clear, and it depends always on who you quote, how much jobs you have. But in the range between, let's say, 5.5 and 7.5 million people are working in the renewable industry. In my home country, Germany, 378,000 people are working in the renewable industry, so roughly 400,000 people. It is for Germany a very important industry, because if you compare it, for example, to the car industry in Germany employs about 900,000 people. So it is half the size of the car industry, and this is not an industry which can be ignored by politicians. And therefore, renewable energy policy in Germany is an industry policy. The wind industry in Germany is the 5th largest customer for the steel industry, because steel is a very important commodity for the wind industry. One wind turbine needs as much steel as about 400 cars. So therefore, it is quite significantly. And we also see that in the EU, more than 1 million people actually work, 1.1, almost 1.2 million people work in the renewable industry, and China has a very large industry of 1.7 million employees as well. I have to say one of the reasons why the EU is going into renewables is, even though sort of the public argument is climate, protecting the climate, the real issue is actually security of supply in order to get independent from Russian gas, and jobs, employment. Because employment is important for every politician, and the beauty of renewable energy is that the money actually remains in the community. While if you spend money for your fuel, usually the fuel goes certainly out of the community, mainly also out of the country. While if you have investment in wind and operation and maintenance cost in wind or solar, those people who do the maintenance for wind are usually in your community, because you can't take foreigners. You need some people who are actually nearby. The spare parts are traded and very often also made within the region. So the money invested in renewables might be the same than conventional, but the effect is that this money remains in the community, and the worker who's doing the maintenance work for a wind turbine, for example, will spend his money in the community as well. So that's a very important issue for renewable development. In our scenario, we have a projection how many jobs you will create. We have between 13 and 12 to 13 million jobs worldwide in the renewable industry. But those are only direct jobs, no indirect jobs. So it's only direct, so that people who are really working directly in the industry, and you can add quite a number of that. Some people say even double the amount if you also calculate indirect jobs. And to a specific example for indirect jobs, for example, more and more solar systems will use battery backup, because you have a very high share already. So the trend is that more systems actually have a battery backup, and also need smart grid regulations. So I know that in your region here, the electronic industry is very large, and therefore the electronic industry will be a very important supplier of equipment for smart grids or for storage or for management of renewable energy systems. In terms of the investment cost, here we see that's the additional investment from our scenario compared to the reference case. We have about $8.7 trillion more, but we save 16 trillion, which means it pays off twice. The interesting effect is that after a while, after the investment is done, you don't need any fuel cost anymore, and then you have a break even in around 10 to 12 years from now. So what has this to do with Taiwan? This is the global solar radiation map. It's very global, and you need, in order to do a proper planning for Taiwan, of course, more specific data. But I think it's quite visual that this is the largest solar market in the world. I live exactly here on this corner. You live there, and you see that you have twice as many sunshine as we have in my home country. So if you would install the system I have at home, you wouldn't get a double output. In Germany, about 7,500 megawatts of new solar panels have been installed last year and the year before. So it's a large market, and you see that your potential in Taiwan is much larger. If you look at the wind potential, again, I compare it to the homeland of wind. Now the largest markets for wind are actually not in Europe anymore. It's here in this area in the US and China. But this is sort of the resource. You see this brownish red color here. The whole west coast has the same potential. So if you compare the wind development from, let's say, Denmark, which has pretty much the same size like Taiwan, your potential is pretty much the same. It's a bit better in some places not as good, but it's equal. So I would say that whatever you see from North Europe in terms of development, at least from the resource and from the cost estimation, you can actually compare directly with Taiwan. Then we took a look on the energy intensity. And you see that the energy intensity of Taiwan is actually not very good. The energy intensity shows how many energy units per dollar GDP you need. So for $1 GDP, how many energy units do you actually need? You can't really compare that with all countries, because you have some service-related countries which have less energy naturally than resource-driven countries. But in terms of the industry structure, I would compare Taiwan to Korea and to Germany and to Japan. Those countries are, in terms of their infrastructure, their mix, are very much the same or equal. And you see that there is room for improvement to reduce the overall energy demand per dollar GDP. That was energy. Now we just go for electricity, and this is even more extreme, that Taiwan is much worse than Korea and Japan. And Japan is very energy intensive as well. And we have done an energy scenario for Japan last year. And it was because all those indicators we can do, we can actually compare other countries. And Japan was by far the most energy efficient country we ever modeled. So it's a very efficient economy. If you compare it to Russia, which was by far the most inefficient country we ever modeled, so the energy demand per unit in Russia was 3 times higher than in Japan. In terms of the global supply, we assume that we can actually achieve 95% by 2050, or in the next 7 years, 37%. Yesterday, the IEA published a new roadmap for renewables, and they are not quite there, but at least they are, I think, at around 28 or so. 28%. So the IEA, as a very conservative institution, they're coming towards us every year a little bit closer. So, so it confirms that the trend is towards renewables. What I don't want to go into all these different colors and what kind of technologies we have, but one interesting fact I would like to highlight, and that's it. You see that here you have basically 2 colors dominating the electricity supply: gas, coal. Both are international commodity prices. Our mix is very colorful. That means we have 7 different technologies. So we are more secure and not as volatile as economies who actually rely only on 2 energy sources for global energy prices. So if the gas price rises or the coal price rises, an economy which is mainly supplied by local renewable energy sources are much stable. Much stabler than one which has a lot of fossil fuel. Or another example, if you build a wind farm, you know that maybe this year it will cost you 8 cents per kilowatt hour to produce the electricity. But you know that in 20 years' time, so in 2033, it will still be 7 or 8 cents. While if you build a coal power plant or gas power plant, you don't know what the price will be. If you build a nuclear power plant, you don't know if it will be actually finished by then. So it is very insecure in terms of going to the conventional power. This is what I just mentioned before. We have more or less the same price development of specific generation costs until 2025. And then there's a huge delta. And this is because once our power plant fleet is more or less established, we save a lot of fuel cost, while the other power plant fleet still needs fuel cost. And therefore, we have the break-even point and then it really pays off. So whatever we invest now, we will benefit for the next generation. So the power plant fleet we have right now has been decided by our parents. And what we decide this year or the next few years, we will decide the energy mix for our children. So it's a long-term decision, and this is also one of the problems we always see worldwide, that politicians always, not very many politicians have the view for the next generation. It's usually towards the next election, and therefore it's not a long-term decision. But on energy policy, you really need to act long-term. In terms of CO2 reduction, this is a population development. The population development we have taken from the UN. So population development in our energy scenario, as well as the global economic growth, is the same like in the World Energy Outlook. So we do not save energy by projecting less people or less economic development. So our CO2 in 2050 is pretty minor. It's just like 80%, over 80% less than today. And the main problem we see, now the first, we achieve equity. So you see the shares of the leftover CO2 by country, and it reflects pretty much the amount of people living there. So we have an equity in terms of how many CO2 per capita is actually emitted, more or less equal around the world. It's a little bit different because of the local resources, but it's relatively even. But the leftover CO2 emission, this is transport. Power generation is this year, and then we have international bunkers. So international bunker is basically fuel for planes and ships, and this is transport, sort of local transport. We see that the challenge, in the most challenging sector for renewable energy, is the transport sector. While electricity and heating, cooling has basically the technology already to go for 100% renewables, transport hasn't. Transport, in terms of public transport, can use electricity. Small cars can use electricity, but big trucks, ships, planes cannot use electricity, so they need to have fuels. Biofuels are also limited because of the competition with nature conservation concerns and food. So this is the most challenging part of the new development, how to actually also make the transport sector fossil fuel free. But if this is also good, and if it's all cheaper and better, why isn't it even faster? And one of the reasons why is we are now coming to a real crunch of the utility sector. Utilities have to change. And actually, one of the largest German utilities, the CEO, 2 weeks ago said, our business model is eroding. And the reason for that is, Germany has right now 32,000 megawatts of solar, 33,000 megawatts of wind. That's together 65,000 megawatts. And this is exactly the demand Germany usually has. So if it's windy and sunny, we could do for a few hours 100%. If it's at night, of course, half of that capacity will definitely be gone. So we have a very flexible power generation. That means that if we accept base load, like nuclear or coal, and this is the load curve, just as a simplified thing to explain the whole problem. You see that if you have a lot of wind, you can get out of it. So you have more wind than needed, for example, or more solar electricity than needed. So what can you do with it? If you accept base load, either you store it in batteries or pump storage, hydro pump storage or hydrogen, or you export it to another region, which is for Taiwan not an option, or you simply shut down the wind farm, also not very economic, and also for the wind farm developer, something which is not acceptable because you can't finance it. So what we say is, we do not accept that, And we want to have priority access and priority dispatching for renewables. And that means that you cut into the baseload profile, which basically means that a nuclear power plant cannot operate 24/7 anymore, or a coal power plant. But the economic calculation for a nuclear power plant or for a coal power plant is based on the fact that the production is 24/7, all the time. If this is not possible, it's not economic, and it's getting more expensive and more expensive. Germany has this situation right now, and the majority of wind and solar is in the hands of private people. 1.4 million German households have their own solar generator, out of 40 million households. That means that the utilities who actually have the majority of the conventional power plants are losing market shares big time. But they incorporated their production in the baseload power plants in their economic business plan. But if they can't sell the electricity 24/7, they are losing out a lot of money. Which means the entire electricity market in Europe is actually sort of shaking. And therefore you hear a lot of conflicting messages especially from Germany, because it's in the forefront, but also Spain, because the fight is now between the established utility and the new business models between the renewable industry. And the government is sort of in between, don't know what to do, and there's also the election in September, which means you can't expect anything smart or meaningful till the election is over anyway. So there is basically right now the discussion. What we propose is that we have baseload is wind and solar. So we take everything what we have on wind and solar, and then we add up, let's say biomass or hydro or geothermal or whatever resource you have, and you maybe also like gas or renewables from other areas in order to meet the demand. Which means we don't have any baseload power plants anymore, and there's a complete different business model. So just to wrap up, very important, we have a base load, but we have not base generation. And in the communication, this is always mixed. Of course, we have a basic load, but not anybody who has the privilege to operate 24/7 if nobody needs it. So what does that mean for the business model, the utility of the future? In the old days, there was a power plant engineering company like GE, like ABB, like Mitsubishi, Alstom, Siemens, who built, projected and manufactured the equipment and built the equipment. But the utility ordered that once a year, less, every 10 years, every 5 years, maybe a new power plant. Then the utility was the owner of that power plant, operator. The fuel supply was usually linked with the utility somehow, and the transmission to the consumer, including the consumer, was all in the hands of the utility. But this business model is eroding, because now you don't have 1 or 2 power plants a year in a country you build, but 10,000 or 20,000. That means that project planning, manufacturing of equipment and installation becomes a very core part of the business. In the future, the power plant comes to the customer, not the electricity. And that's a very different business model. More and more manufacturers of wind turbines and solar equipment actually don't sell their equipment anymore. They keep the project and sell the electricity. The majority of the new German project developers, or also manufacturers of wind turbines, they actually don't sell their turbines anymore. They sell it if you want to, but usually they try to keep it and sell the electricity. That means you have more and more players who actually sell electricity on the market. The owner of the power plant is not the utility anymore, but the customer. Fuel supply is actually not needed in many cases, except biomass. And the grid in the liberalized market is gone anyway, because this is a sort of a free marketplace, and therefore it's usually controlled by the government. or operated by a private company, but under strict rule of the government. So the entire business model, the entire value chain for a utility disappears. Last but not least, that means also a very, very different way of operating and also a different way of software which is needed and operation maintenance. More and more prognosis for generation data is needed. So I need to know how much electricity will I generate tomorrow in this specific area. And this is a new business. In Europe, where you can buy the service that meteorological institutions sell prognosis 48 hours ahead of time in 15-minute steps. So right now it's 5 minutes to 3, which also means I have to wrap up. And tomorrow at 5 minutes to 3, they will say, okay, you have in this specific area this amount of electricity produced by solar and wind. So the grid operator knows that and puts it in his plan for the production. You also need to know exactly where this power plant is located in order to do the proper planning. When you hear smart grid, that usually means that the grid operator knows where the production is. Currently the grid is not stupid, but what the grid operator does not know is the grid operator delivers to, let's say, to one street, and the entire street for this grid operator is only one consumer. He knows in this street I deliver 10 megawatts right now. But if all those houses have actually solar, for some reason there is no demand. There is a demand, but they all generate the electricity themselves. So a smart grid basically enables the grid operator to know what's actually going on in each house. This seriously changes the way utility operates. Last but not least, and I finish with that, this is a model from Denmark. Denmark has 30% wind electricity already. They're gearing up to 50% wind electricity. And what they do is, it's a pilot project. They have cities, like this city here, and they all have their own renewable energy supply, but they get also, of course, electricity from the grid, like from offshore wind. Denmark has quite a lot of offshore wind. But if there's no wind, the grid operator can disconnect the entire city from the national grid. And then they actually lower the demand in the national grid by switching off entire communities or entire cities. This city has its own generation capacity and its own storage capacity. If there's too much wind, the storage will be filled by wind turbines from abroad. So this is a very different way of operating. And this is also some sort of a cultural shock for many utilities. And with this, I would like to end. And thank you very much for your attention.
我们刚刚听的，虽然很多的内容是非常有革命的这个内涵的啊。那我想再稍稍补充一点点跟大家做一点说明我的一些看法。那我们从这一章开始看这章是57%比上43%，也就是现在目前虽然主要想要的是说把这边的43%能够超越过去能够到达差不多90%也就这边的57%要退位这边57%都包含的这个瓦斯就是气体还有这个煤还有这个还有那个核能。这边要退位退位。换句话说呢，以现在这个看起来，大概是以经济来看的话，目前这边有实力，有这个可以有竞争力有竞争力。但是未来来看的话呢，因为它是一个新的一个技术呢，很明显的价格会下降，量会起来现在目前已经很明显的上来那我想要补充的是这个生态可持续发展跟经济的交汇我要提3一处方那我认为废核是必要的一个基础我看Sven刚才讲也可以了解。生态学呢，我们一直都被人家误解就生态跟经济是冲突我常讲说，生态跟经济是本是同根生，相煎何太急 只要你看英文的话呢，它是eco开头，一个 ecology 呢，一个是 economy 啊。所以生态学是什么？就是自然的经济啊，违反经济的自然生物呢，都被淘汰了啊。演化过程中呢，所有的生命现象都是经济原则啊。所以经济原则就是成本要小于获利啊。也就是说，所有的这些生物啊，在地球上的各种的生物的运作，或是生态的原则呢，都是经济原则。那我们希望在地球上，包括人类在内呢，能够合乎生态的原则或是经济的原则。那有3个东西要照顾到，一个就是环境，还有生活，另外一个就是经济。好的环境、好的生活跟好的经济呢，这是我们所谓可持续发展或永续发展的3个基础。但这3个基础呢，建立在这个树冠上面呢，它跟自然的关系需要有一个好的关系，那这叫做环境伦理。所以我们需要有科技啊，有好的环境、好的生活、好的经济，但是也要跟环境保持一个好的关系啊，就是环境伦理的关系。好，那我们怎么样能够做到呢？在经济学家啊，Dr. Yang 他写啊，他读完生态学之后呢，他是经济学者啊，他提出3个啊，就3个E啊，3个E开头的处方了哈，也就是治疗这个疾病的处方。环境保全、经济效率跟公平啊。那这个原则上我们看呢，就是一定要停掉核电啊，停掉核电是迈向永续发展，或是迈向一个好的未来呢一个第一步了啊，第一步。那我们从这个3E来看，第一个环境保全啊，就是环境要保持安全完整的，核电厂就是违反了啊。第一个核废料的问题，辐射伤害的问题，万一发生核灾的话，那环境真是就是完蛋了啊。另外是伦理的考量啊，那很明显的呢，只要是对于这种公共安全来讲，我们需要采取经漏原则。以经漏原则来讲的话呢，那核电厂是没办法通过我们的考验的。第2个是经济效率啊，经济效率就是一个很重要的原则，是经济原则，同时也是生态原则了哈，是自然生态的原则。成本一定要小于获利啊。那核电明显的是不经济了哈。现在目前讲的经济呢，因为是它当做基载，刚刚 Spade 讲了，因为它当做基载呢，所以365天全年无休的 run 啊，所以平均起来每一度的电才会经营。只要是跟其他发电方式自由竞争的话呢，核电的经营将会有很大的困难，一定会被淘汰。另外，厨艺的问题、核废的问题啊，另外安全标准的问题啊，另外它的热转换效率也是最差的啊，在各种发电方法里。另外是同世代跟跨世代公平啊，那同世代公平就是它所存在的位置呢，受当地的限制啊，会受到这个限制，它健康风险跟土地发展受到限制。那跨世代公平呢，主要是它的这个享用电力是现在的，但是未来数百个世代呢要去供养这些核废料啊，这对我们未来的世代呢是明显的非常的不公平。所以我们来看呢，这个现在目前呢用到最大，就是在夏天用到最大的时候呢，其实也差不多在这个地方左右了。2012年在这个地方，所以把核电全部都废掉呢，其实我们也不会缺电啊，何况我们还有很大的空间啊，在节约能源上，或者在整个设备上改善，或者在增加再生能源上还有大的空间。那核四当然也是不经济不划算的。那我们刚刚看这就是虽然他刚刚最后讲的也就是说革命性的改变嘛。我们一直到现在，台湾还是这样就是一直在强调，包括马政府马总统也在强调说，这个基载不能废了核电是基载很重要，是因为他在这样的框架里面他认为说，这个地方就要靠核电或燃煤基础这个大基础来撑住这个场面，然后再来加上其他的所以他会埋怨说呢，这个其他的再生能源常常会有时候多有时候少，有时候多有时候少，所以这种能源呢不经济不好用 啊，不经济不好用是因为它用这个框架框住，才会造成这样的结果。假若说我们不用这样的框架啊，我们用另外一个框架，假如用这个框架的话呢，这个情况就不太一样啊，就完全不一样，不是不太一样，完全不一样。我们把这些再生能源呢，当做基载来用，你当做基载来用的话呢，平均每一度电的经济效益就高了，因为它乱的时间长了，乱的时间长的话呢，平均每单位时间的成本就可以下降，就可以下降。基载之后，然后我们用呢，它用这个生质能水力和地热等来调控它，调控它，这些比较稳定的来调控它，调控来稳定，来供应我们的需求，这是一天24小时里面。那这样的架构呢，就会把核电厂是燃煤整个把它淘汰掉。好，那最后另外一个就是我一直在强调说，我们要发展这个 passive solar energy， 所谓的这个我是把它翻译叫做核阳技术了跟太阳和平相处的或者合作的技术。那这个技术包含了很多方面包括隔热的，包括通风，包括吸热，包括吸光热、光电阻裂解水或者是 heat pump 这个热泉那最后，我们整个政府呢，或是要革命性的改变呢，它一定要靠所谓的民意的改变，民意改变。因为现在目前的这个学华呢、官僚或财团呢，他们还是存留在旧时代一直用它那个框架框住我们的一些想法跟看法，所以他们一直执意的说呢，一定要核电没有核电，我们好像就经济就会垮那这是一个旧框架把我们框住了，那影响的政策、影响的经济、影响我们的民意，所以我们需要什么呢？我们需要民意的改变，民意的改变由个人开始做手每一个人认知上一定要提升我们要多了解之后，再加上一些伦理的价值的判断，然后产生出来的力量来影响民意民意的影响呢，才有办法改变政策让我们经济有所改变。所以我们呢，应该准备每一个人呢，要准备来改变这个世界，而不是被这个世界来改变。谢谢大家。
My name is Andy Lee. I'm a student, graduate student at Duke University. I'm studying energy and environmental management. So, from your speech, you highlight that there's a lot of developer in wind and solar power industry. But in Taiwan, I think it would take a long time for incubate that kind of industry in the industry ecosystem in Taiwan. What can a civil society or individual or entrepreneur or venture capital could do, like in Germany, to incubate those kind of industry in our ecosystem? And the second question I have is that you highlight a lot of potential opportunity in develop renewable energy, including energy efficiency, deregulation, different kind of renewable energy, as well as electric power car and other kind of form of new energy. What is the most cost-effective and most promising for Taiwan to develop from your perspective? And what could government do to implement those kind of policy? Thank you.
I think there are three very cost-effective technologies on the renewable energy side. This is solar, wind, and geothermal. And I think it's a very good mix because, for example, Germany has no potential at all for geothermal. We are right in the middle of a continental shelf. There is hardly any potential. But here, yet there is. So if you combine solar and wind with a dispatchable power generation like geothermal, you have actually a good mix of different technologies. In terms of transport, I came here by this fast speed train. I would say that Germany can learn from you on public transport. We were on time, which is German trains are usually not on time. For some reason they have the reputation to be on time, but I can guarantee you it's not the case. So I can't tell you anything about that. In terms of how can actually this be implemented in a society, I think it is very important that the policy is in a way like with a feed-in tariff, you actually have a feed-in tariff, but there must be some other elements added that small and medium-sized businesses can actually develop their own projects. The majority of the wind projects, for example, are community-based projects. They are developed in the community and they want wind. If the development is done in a way that foreigners or let's say even people from other provinces within Taiwan come into a coastal village and say, well, we build a wind farm, you usually have problems. Not because of the technology, but because it's no local acceptance. It doesn't come from the local people. So the acceptance must, that local people must benefit from it, also economically. The German farmers compete on the international food market prices. And like for Germany, food like potatoes is like for Taiwan rice. Potatoes is very important. Potatoes from our neighboring country Poland are cheaper because cheaper labor. So potato farmers have a real problem to compete with its prices. But they have wind over their fields. So in between their fields they have wind farms or wind turbines. And they harvest wind over their fields, they get income from the electricity, and that gives us another income. They also use their barns for solar. An average size solar system for a farmer in Germany is around half a megawatt to a megawatt. So they do have that, and they actually start with biogas. This is all related to a policy, to a feed-in law policy, which is bankable. So you can actually go to the bank and say, I have this project here, this is the estimated outcome, and now I get a loan from the bank, and the bank gives you the loan because the feed-in law is so secure that even if something happens and you can't pay the bill, the bank will just take over the wind farm and can get the money back. Roughly 25% of all the 30,000 wind turbines, for example, are financed by Deutsche Bank, by a very big German bank. And they actually now have their own department for financing this. So it is very important that it's bottom-up planning. It's top-down financing, top-down policy, but bottom-up planning. And this is the main reason why there is hardly any conflict in my home country. Where I live, we have about 5,000 megawatts. And there was only one project which was seriously under debate and conflict, and that was because South German investors came and not North Germans. So that was the main conflict. Renewable industry in Taiwan, I think the industry structure is relatively similar to Germany. You have a little bit more electronic industry. So photovoltaics is certainly electronics. Smart grid is certainly electronics and software, and maybe batteries. And steel industry is wind. So I would say from the structure, it is also, as I said in my first statement, that solar, wind, and geothermal are probably the preferred options.
那我回应郑教授，还有我们贵宾他演讲的部分，像所谓的机载的部分，那热的应该是可以从夜间还是可以用太阳能发电。为什么？因为太阳光热的部分，它晚上可以储热，它那个储热不需要用电池，它只需要用盐卤。那这个部分 China 已经在做。这一部分是大家比较不清楚。那因为今天我们讲的是能源革命嘛，那我们要一些比较不一样的思考，然后针对在技术上可以提升的部分。那所以核能的部分确实是不需要用得到，因为它那个分子去被撞击分裂的时候，对环境危害是相当大。那我们的想法是认为说，还有一个可能就是欧洲、比利时在发展自由的能源，那这一部分应该是可以被取代，因为那个是电磁能的部分。 那这个未来还要看一些发展。谢谢。
Right now, a very large competition on storage, the storage technologies. I think it's a little bit divided. While in Japan, in Korea, and in China, and maybe also here, battery technology is sort of the technology will be developed. German engineers go more into renewable methane, so cracking water into oxygen and hydrogen, adding carbon, and then you have natural gas basically, which you can store relatively easy and burn in gas power plants. We'll see who will win, or probably a mix of all different technology will be the case. In terms of battery technology, we did not promote battery technology from the very beginning because it wasn't needed, and we also wanted to be a resource, in terms of the resource, very economic. And imagine if everybody would have his own battery pack, that was also a lot of batteries. And batteries usually last 7 to 10 years and you have to replace them. So I agree, I think that batteries will play a role, but for the situation we have right now, in many countries, also in China, where we have a lot of curtailment for wind because of the competition with coal, storage will not be the solution in this case. It will be more a different management, but the truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
像以前在京都议定书的时候，最大的反对国就是美国跟中国嘛。那一向他们都把能源当作是一种国防武力，就是强大武力的象征嘛。那我要问的就是说，其实能源革命，我是觉得应该就是来自于所谓的民间力量。像刚才那个就是演讲者讲过的，德国我有去过，其实这个国家我也觉得蛮好玩的。我从布莱姆要坐到汉堡的时候，一共 delay 了1小时。那我觉得说，德国不是很准时的吗？为什么还会 delay 1小时？原来我是觉得他们的民间力量有在改变。那我要问的第一个问题就是说，德国甚至瑞典我有去过，丹麦，我觉得这3个国家是不是因为民间力量去推动所谓的能源革命？这是我一直在想要好奇问的问题。第二个，我是觉得台湾的电力似乎是被垄断掉了。其实刚才讲的说，一个再生能源是可以由社区的、由议员有这边有在的。比如说，我们可以发展 OP， 每地区都是再生能源，然后共享共用，甚至呢，参与的民众都可以获利的。可是似乎永远都是有一个很高大的地位的在压力，那个叫做台湾电力公司，因为他发现如果影响到他的地位的时候，他就千方百计，不是从法令上啊，或是合组上，就是把你阻碍。所以似乎我们民意是不是要认清楚这个事实？这个阻碍我们能源革命的，似乎在我们的中央的话，有一些特定的单位是在阻碍的。这是2个问题。好，抱歉。
那个政策那个制度的不一样呢，就会有不一样的结果了啊。假如说我们把电力多元化，就刚刚那个虽然讲的，就是把它多元化，变成很多种不同的发电方式啊，然后把它变供应跟需求都在，比如说需求者也在供应者，那到社区去的时候，那台电自然就瓦解了，就是就剩下它只有输电系统，其他就它的供应系统的那个整个就瓦解了，就说制度上只要改变，那结果就会不一样啊，就不一样。那多元化是很重要，多元自研啊，多元化跟自由化啊，就电力多元化，动力自由化啊，然后再加上一个在地化，也就是说电力的供应是在地生产、在地消费啊，这事实上合乎我们的有机农业啊。那我相信，整个世界就会变得不一样。
In terms of the civil society, I would start with Germany and also Denmark, because it is from the mentality different than, let's say, from Belgium. The anti-nuclear movement in Germany was more than just an anti-nuclear movement in the 70s. It was also the start of the new political class of politicians. We have, let's say, we had a chancellor in 2000 until 2008 who was part of the anti-nuclear movement, and his vice chancellor was one of the head of the anti-nuclear movement from the Green Party. So the nuclear movement socialized and politicized the society quite a bit. And right now, if you support nuclear as a politician, you will certainly lose elections, because 70% of the German society is anti-nuclear. So if you want to commit suicide as a politician, you support nuclear. So this is a very comfortable place, of course, to develop. But I think here comes the very typical Danish and German mentality, which is, I think, in some cases actually maybe even similar to the Taiwanese sort of mentality. Is like ideas, sort of engineering. This is a lot of time answer of problems. So if Germans have a problem, they try to build a machine. Yeah, this is like so a lot of engineers, a lot of people of the anti-nuclear movement studied engineering. I did it. I basically decided to study engineering when I was 20, a week after Chernobyl exploded. So that's why I studied engineering and specialized on wind engineering. So this is basically a political reason to study a very technical subject, and therefore the development of technology is almost a political statement. And this is the same mentality also in Denmark to some extent. Well, you add a little bit the independence. In Denmark, independence is very high value. So they want to be independent from electricity imports. All those motivations, and climate at this time wasn't an issue at all. We actually didn't know that we have a problem with climate at this time. It was more being independent and against nuclear. And I think that's a strong motivation. And also the feed-in law, if you see the development of the feed-in law, it was not done in a way that the government actually set up a feed-in law. It was that anti-nuclear activists built their own wind turbines and feed electricity illegal in the grid. The utility took them to court, and they say, yes, take us to court. Then they took 5 years, they win the court case, and as a consequence, they had to establish a feed-in law. And the former Chancellor, Helmut Kohl, he signed the first feed-in law in 1991, so more than 20 years ago, with a statement, it won't work anyway. Okay, here we are, 400,000 jobs later. So it worked, but they didn't believe in it. So it was a bottom-up development of the entire industry, and that's why it's a very different situation than if you basically impose the industry top-down. You always need this fundament. And I think that's the main reason why it's actually working.